So the title of my talk today is Trajectories of Loneliness During the COVID-19 Pandemic in the UAS. First, I'd like to thank school funders that sort of helped make this work possible at the PRGS school, the Pardee Graduate School. I would also like to thank my dissertation committee and mentors, Andrew Parker, who is here, Katie Carmen, who should be online, and Lindsay Ayer. All right, so loneliness is often defined as a mismatch between actual and desired social connections, sort of a response, often uh, considered a stress response that uh, sort of indicates for individuals that their social health isn't everything that it could be. And so if you look at American time use surveys in the past 2 decades, all of the data indicate that engagement with friends and family, for example, has been going down. Also, social isolation has been going up. So even before the pandemic, loneliness and social isolation have been considered growing issues. This is a problem because as a stress response, loneliness is associated with severe health impacts. For example, you've probably heard of the statement, the health impact of loneliness is comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. There's a lot of evidence pointing towards causal sort of mechanisms, but the point here is that health is severely impacted by the experience of loneliness and social isolation. So much that the Office of the US Surgeon General has sort of created this national strategy last year to try to ameliorate the problem. So in this document, they lay out sort of this national strategy to address this issue at a policy level. So this was an issue before, and then this happened, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this experience. We were all stuck at home for a while, going to bed, going to Zoom meetings, seeing people from afar, and wearing masks. It was definitely an interesting experience in probably bad ways, but the question remains sort of what was the impact of the pandemic on loneliness? The pandemic sort of forced people to physically distance, right? It sort of created hurdles for people to have face-to-face contact. Um, so it's an interesting time to try to understand what the impact on loneliness was. This is sort of a social shock, right, that individuals experienced. And it was probably a good opportunity for us to learn how individuals dealt with this situation. The few studies that have been done on loneliness during the pandemic have actually showed mixed results. The few reviews that I've seen indicated that there were small and heterogeneous increases in loneliness when compared sort of to pre-pandemic measures. Some even saw no population level increases. And so with most of, or any psychological construct that you could think of, and you're looking at this change over time, you could think of within and between individual effects. And so the question for me was, if we look at the pandemic, what were the main trajectories of change experienced during the pandemic? Also, what was sort of interesting to me to learn more about is what factors were associated with those changes. And then we could also switch the view and ask what factors were associated with wave-to-wave changes in loneliness. The hypothesis here was, given the priors in the literature and given what we know about psychological sort of experiences, is that individuals experience the pandemic in different ways, right? Some might have experienced more loneliness, some might have experienced less, some might not have really experienced any change. So to answer these questions, we used data from the Understanding America study panel, specifically the COVID-19 longitudinal panels. Many of you will be familiar with those, so I won't go into detail on them, but they were sort of run during the pandemic bi-weekly. Every few weeks, there was a survey that was run on most of the panel members. Here specifically, we use waves 4 of 26 of the survey, which correspond to the dates between April 2020 and April 2021. So bi-weekly measures sort of over a year, roughly. And we only include I only include individuals who have at least 2 measurements of loneliness because I wanted to understand trajectories of change. So the N comes down to around 7,800, so an attrition of sort of around 1,000 from the original total panel number of panel respondents. The outcome we're looking at here, in the past 7 days, how often have you felt lonely? It's not a perfect measure of loneliness, but studies have shown that it sort of has good concurrent validity with other measures we often use, like the UCLA loneliness scale. But in this context, for example, where time is of the essence in surveys, it's a good enough measure to capture the concept. Because we also wanted to understand change over time and sort of what might have affected those change, we looked at other time varying and time invariant covariates in the survey. The survey is very rich in these other measures such as employment, mental health, levels of social interaction, as well as the other covariates like age, sex, uh, urban rural status, education, and income. So we'll look at some of that as well. So to analyze the data, we use two methods. One is often uh, seen as a person-centric approach, and another is seen as a variable-centric approach. Growth mixture modeling often tells you what are the groups of trajectories, sort of are there discernible differences between individuals that are sort of noticeable over time. It answers questions about intra-individual variability. The way we usually fit these models is we fit multiple models and then we try to find the best fit, and then we predict who belongs in each class using multinomial logic models. The other method here, which I also use to understand what predicts a increase in loneliness within a certain wave, as opposed to what the trajectories are longitudinal mixed models. So that's the variable-centric approach. Specifically, I use the random effects within between model to understand the within individual and between individual effects in time-varying predictors. I'll show you in a bit what that means specifically. What's interesting in this study to me was as well trying to fit those longitudinal models within each of the growth classes to understand if there's sort of differences between those classes for the within and the between individual effects. So what do we find? So this is sort of the measure of interest, loneliness, how in the past 7 days, how often have you felt lonely? And what you see here is 4 response options. Not at all, 1 to 2 days, 3 to 4 days, 5 to 7 days. Not the best distribution, but we could work with it. And essentially, you see kind of a flat distribution over time that if you average those responses, you just see this flat line, no change. And this was not actually very different from what we'd seen in the literature. But the whole point is to understand what makes up this flat line. And so if you take 16 random respondents, and you try to understand their trajectories, you see that there's all sorts of trajectories, right? There's flat line, there's increases followed by decreases. There's also some missing data. So this is sort of where we need to try to understand what are the classes of these trajectories. And that's essentially what the GMM does. The growth mixture model tells us the clusters of growth trajectories. So we fit the models and compare them. The best fitting model was the following 3-class model. As you can see here, it's made up of 3 different classes. The first biggest class is the bold line at the bottom. We call that the stable low loneliness. So 80% of the population sort of exhibits this flat mean over time. So they do not experience increases and decreases as much as the other groups. The remaining 20% of the population is in the other dashed and dotted lines. They start off high, experiencing around 3 to 4 days of loneliness in the past week, but then they kind of diverge. A bigger group stays sort of consistently lonely, and a smaller group, around 7%, decreases and then goes back to the original intercept. So who's within each class? We regressed the class membership on a bunch of variables, such as the covariates I mentioned, as well as social interactions, but here I'm going to show you a few of them. For example, males tended to be overrepresented in the high loneliness group when compared to the low stable class. The 65 or older age group was overrepresented in the high class when compared to the lowest age group, which is 18 to 29. Being married is associated with both being in the low loneliness class as compared to the high and medium classes, especially when compared to being separated, divorced, widowed, or not being married. Unemployment is also makes you more likely to be part of the high or medium loneliness classes. And the final sort of variable here is PHQ. That's a measure of mental health. It shows that if you are high in mental health, you're more likely to be both in the high loneliness and middle loneliness classes compared to the lowest. I'm running out of time, but here I will show you that. So the UAS has had a different survey with a UCLA measure of loneliness captured back in April 2019. So this helps us understand how these groups were faring a year before the pandemic. And what you see is that the lowest stable class was also the lowest on the UCLA loneliness score back a year back, and then the middle and the high were also high with not sort of a big difference between them. So looking at the within and between models, what was interesting here was the following. You can look at employment and retirement and working from home, for example. You see that unemployment has a significant effect both within and between. This indicates that those who are consistently unemployed are more lonely than those who are not employed. But also it indicates if someone experienced unemployment during the pandemic, then they were more lonely on those weeks when they were unemployed compared to when they were. But you don't see a similar effect with respect to retirement and working from home. So being consistently retired does not mean you're more lonely than someone who isn't. But experiencing retirement during the pandemic makes you more likely to experience loneliness. You also see mental health here is significant as well, as we saw in the GMM class model. One last set of slides. What was interesting here for me is sort of comparing the within effects on the main social interaction variables that we looked at across the GMM classes. So here, what this shows is that the effect of social interactions in reducing loneliness within a certain wave, was larger for individuals who are high in trait loneliness, so those who are in the high group, when compared to sort of the low stable group. What this means, for example, is if you are consistently lonely, and then within a certain week you have visitors over or you see visitors, your decrease in loneliness is higher than if you had been someone in a low stable class. What this indicates, maybe perhaps, is that policy approaches that, for example, try to ameliorate fatigue in the pandemic and try to allow individuals to be out there in the world for a short period of time might benefit those who are in the high loneliness class sort of more than those who are not typically that lonely. So to conclude, these were the main findings. Essentially, there were three main patterns of change in loneliness. Around 80% of the US sample, and therefore the US population, exhibited resilience to loneliness during the pandemic. Being male, unmarried, living alone, experiencing unemployment, worse mental health, and more loneliness before the pandemic was associated with experiencing more loneliness during the pandemic. This suggests that some specific high-risk groups sort of can be targeted for support during the pandemic. Having to isolate quarantine was associated with experiencing more loneliness, while working from home and attending public gatherings had very little associations. This suggests that different pandemic mitigation strategies have different effects, essentially. Social media use did not have a sort of significant association with loneliness. And finally, as I said, being high in trait loneliness is associated with experiencing larger fluctuations in loneliness brought about from social interactions. That's it. Thank you.